You wake up, brush your teeth, swish your antiseptic mouthwash to be perfectly healthy, and go about your day. But what if I told you that this exact healthy morning habit is systematically destroying your blood vessels? Today, we are exposing the biological link between your mouthwash, nitric oxide, and your erectile dysfunction. This video is for educational purposes only. ED can be an early sign of severe cardiovascular disease or diabetes. Consult your physician or cardiologist before starting any new supplement protocol or ignoring prescribed medications. Now, here is the vascular truth. Erectile dysfunction is rarely just a performance problem. In many men, it is an endothelial problem, a sign that the inner lining of the blood vessels is no longer functioning properly. The endothelium is not passive tissue. It is an active biological organ that regulates blood flow, vascular tone, and the release of nitric oxide, which is essential for healthy vasodilation. When endothelial function declines, blood vessels become less responsive, blood flow falls, and erectile dysfunction often appears as an early warning signal of broader cardiovascular disease. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what an erection actually is. An erection is fundamentally a blood flow event. When the endothelium is healthy, it releases nitric oxide, a signaling molecule that tells the surrounding smooth muscle to relax. That relaxation opens the vessel, improves vasodilation, and allows more blood to enter the tissue. So when nitric oxide signaling is strong, circulation improves. When it is weak, vessels stay tighter, blood flow drops, and erectile function suffers. This is why erectile dysfunction so often tracks with hypertension, diabetes, oxidative stress, and other forms of vascular injury. And that is why I want you to stop thinking of erectile dysfunction as an isolated issue. In clinical terms, it can function like a vascular alarm bell. The same biology that affects penile blood flow can also reflect the condition of the coronary arteries, the brain, and the rest of the circulatory system. Major cardiovascular organizations have emphasized that ED can be associated with a higher risk of future cardiovascular events, which is exactly why men with ED deserve a serious medical evaluation, not shame, not guesswork, and not silence. So before anyone reaches for a quick fix, the real question is this: what is undermining endothelial function in the first place? Because if the root biology is impaired, symptoms will keep returning. In the next section, we are going to trace that biology to one of the most important molecules in the human body, nitric oxide, and then to a daily habit most men never suspect. If you are dealing with erectile dysfunction, take it seriously as a medical signal and discuss it with a clinician, especially if you also have high blood pressure, diabetes, chest discomfort, or reduced exercise tolerance. The miracle molecule is nitric oxide, often abbreviated as NO. In vascular biology, NO is not a fringe concept. It is one of the body's core regulators of vessel tone, blood pressure, and blood flow. The endothelium, the thin inner lining of your blood vessels, continuously produces nitric oxide to help keep circulation flexible, responsive, and healthy. When the endothelium is functioning well, nitric oxide diffuses into the surrounding smooth muscle and tells it to relax. That relaxation is vasodilation. In plain English, the vessel opens wider, resistance falls, and blood flow improves. That is not a minor detail. That is the fundamental mechanism that lets tissue receive the oxygen and nutrients it needs. Now, here is where the story becomes clinically important for men with erectile dysfunction. Erectile function is highly dependent on nitric oxide signaling. In the penis, nitric oxide activates the cGMP pathway, which reduces smooth muscle contraction and permits blood to enter the erectile tissue. Without enough nitric oxide, that entire cascade weakens. That is why erectile dysfunction is so often a vascular problem, not simply a confidence problem. If nitric oxide bioavailability falls, the smooth muscle does not relax efficiently, the vessels do not dilate properly, and blood flow becomes insufficient for a reliable erection. This is why nitric oxide matters far beyond sexual function. It is a central signaling molecule in cardiovascular physiology. It helps regulate vascular tone, supports normal circulation, and participates in the maintenance of healthy endothelial function. When nitric oxide signaling is impaired, the consequences are not isolated to one organ system. They can reflect broader vascular dysfunction throughout the body. That is also why clinicians take erectile dysfunction seriously. In many men, it is an early manifestation of endothelial dysfunction, which can appear before more obvious cardiovascular symptoms. In other words, the body may be giving you a vascular warning long before it gives you a crisis. The key message is simple. Nitric oxide is the language your blood vessels use to stay open, responsive, and healthy. If that language is muted, blood flow suffers. If blood flow suffers, erectile function suffers. That is why the next question is not whether nitric oxide matters. It absolutely does. The real question is how to support it biologically, and that is where we go next. The body's nitric oxide pathways, what helps them, what damages them, and why an apparently harmless habit can quietly interfere with the system men depend on every single day. Now we get to the mechanism that most men have never been taught, the nitrate-nitrite pathway. This is one of the body's most important backup systems for nitric oxide production. Here's the basic biology. When you eat nitrate-rich foods, especially leafy greens and beets, those nitrates are absorbed, circulated, and then concentrated in the saliva. From there, the body depends on a very specific population of symbiotic oral bacteria, especially on the back of the tongue, to reduce nitrate into nitrite. That nitrite is then swallowed and can be converted into nitric oxide in the stomach and in tissues throughout the body. So when I say your mouth matters, I mean that literally. Your oral microbiome is part of your vascular physiology. This is where antiseptic mouthwash becomes biologically relevant. Broad-spectrum antibacterial mouthwashes can suppress the nitrate-reducing bacteria that live in the oral cavity. In controlled studies, antiseptic mouthwash reduced oral nitrite production and lowered plasma nitrite, which is a meaningful signal that the enterosalivary nitric oxide pathway has been disrupted. In other words, when you repeatedly sterilize the mouth, you may also be silencing one of the body's natural nitric oxide factories. And the downstream effect matters because nitric oxide is not just a laboratory marker, it is a vasodilator. It tells smooth muscle to relax, helps blood vessels open, and supports healthy endothelial function. When the nitrate-nitrite pathway is interrupted, nitric oxide bioavailability can fall, and that can translate into less vasodilation, stiffer vessels, and poorer blood flow. That is the vascular logic behind the concern. If the oral microbiome is suppressed, the body may lose one of its simplest natural routes for maintaining nitric oxide balance. This is also why the story is bigger than the mouth. Researchers have shown that disrupting this pathway can blunt nitric oxide-related blood pressure responses, and reviews now describe antiseptic mouthwash as one of the agents that can interfere with the enterosalivary nitrate cycle. That does not mean mouthwash is the only factor, and it does not prove that every man who uses mouthwash will develop erectile dysfunction. But it does mean this habit may be an underappreciated stressor on vascular biology in vulnerable men. For the man already dealing with endothelial dysfunction, diabetes, hypertension, smoking, or metabolic disease, that additional hit may matter. So the practical takeaway is not panic, it is precision. The goal is to protect nitric oxide biology, not to wage war on your mouth. Because if your daily routine is stripping away nitrate-reducing bacteria, you may be compromising a pathway that supports endothelial function, vasodilation, and ultimately blood flow. And that is why, in the next chapter, we have to compare this disrupted pathway with the tools men usually reach for first: standard PDE5 inhibitor medication, and then contrast that with a more upstream approach aimed at supporting nitric oxide production itself. Now let us compare two very different strategies: L-Citrulline and PDE5 inhibitors such as sildenafil, the active ingredient in Viagra. They are not the same thing, and they do not act at the same point in the biology. One works upstream by supporting nitric oxide production. The other works downstream by preserving the signal that nitric oxide already started. That distinction matters. Let us start with Viagra. Sildenafil does not create nitric oxide. It does not replace endothelial function. What it does is inhibit PDE5, the enzyme that breaks down cGMP. By blocking that breakdown, sildenafil allows the nitric oxide signal to last longer and work more effectively, but only after sexual stimulation has already triggered local nitric oxide release. The FDA label is explicit. Sildenafil has no direct relaxant effect in the absence of sexual stimulation. In practical terms, that means Viagra is a biological amplifier. It can be highly effective, but it is still dependent on a functioning nitric oxide signal to begin with. So, if the underlying problem is poor endothelial function, low nitric oxide bioavailability, or disrupted vascular signaling, PDE5 inhibition may help the response, but it does not repair the root cause. This is a clinical inference from the mechanism, not a claim that the medication is ineffective overall. PDE5 inhibitors are well-established therapies for erectile dysfunction, but they work by enhancing the nitric oxide cGMP pathway rather than replacing it. L-Citrulline is different. It is an amino acid that helps the body support nitric oxide production through the arginine pathway. In the body, citrulline can be converted into arginine, and arginine is the substrate used by nitric oxide synthase to generate nitric oxide. In other words, L-Citrulline sits upstream of the signal. It helps provide raw material for nitric oxide synthesis rather than simply protecting the signal after it appears. That is why L-Citrulline is often discussed as a root support strategy, especially in men whose issue may be reduced nitric oxide availability rather than an isolated erection problem. In a small randomized trial, oral L-Citrulline improved erection hardness in men with mild erectile dysfunction, although the evidence base is much smaller than the one for prescription PDE5 inhibitors. That is an important distinction. L-Citrulline is promising, but it is not a direct pharmaceutical substitute for sildenafil. So the way I want you to think about this is simple. Viagra is a rescue tool for the nitric oxide pathway. L-Citrulline is a substrate support tool for the nitric oxide pathway. One helps preserve the message, the other helps the body make more of the message. For a man with erectile dysfunction, that distinction can change the entire strategy, and that is exactly why some men need a conversation about the root biology, not just symptom control. In the next chapter, I am going to show you how that root support approach can be organized into a vascular protocol designed to support endothelial function, smooth muscle relaxation, and natural nitric oxide production. At this point, the strategy becomes practical. The goal is not to chase erections as isolated events. The goal is to support the vascular system that makes erections possible in the first place. That means protecting endothelial function, reducing oxidative stress, supporting nitric oxide production, and being honest about any daily habit that may be disrupting those pathways. Endothelial dysfunction is closely tied to reduced nitric oxide bioavailability, and oxidative stress can directly inactivate nitric oxide, which is one reason vascular support has to be upstream, not cosmetic. So here is the first correction. Do not assume that stronger antiseptic mouthwash is always the smarter choice. If you are using it daily without a medical reason, it is worth reconsidering whether you are unnecessarily suppressing the oral bacteria that help convert dietary nitrates into nitrite. That pathway matters for nitric oxide biology and blood pressure regulation. Controlled studies show antiseptic mouthwash can reduce oral nitrite production and lower plasma nitrite, which means it can disrupt the enterosalivary nitrate-nitrite pathway that contributes to nitric oxide availability. Now, for men asking what to do beyond that, one reasonable conversation is about targeted nutritional support. L-Citrulline is not Viagra. It is an amino acid that supports the arginine nitric oxide pathway upstream, helping the body make nitric oxide rather than only preserving the signal after the fact. Clinical studies have found oral L-Citrulline can improve erection hardness in men with mild erectile dysfunction, although the evidence base is far smaller than for prescription PDE5 inhibitors. That is why a root cause protocol often has two levels. Remove what is impairing nitric oxide biology and add what supports it. On the prescription side, PDE5 inhibitors such as sildenafil work downstream by preserving cGMP, the nitric oxide second messenger. Sildenafil does not create nitric oxide, and the FDA label notes it requires sexual stimulation to work. On the support side, L-Citrulline and antioxidant-focused nutrition may help provide raw material and reduce oxidative stress that would otherwise consume nitric oxide. This is where the soft sell fits naturally. The official Red Boost product pages describe a formula built around circulation and nitric oxide support, and they list ingredients including L-Citrulline, Icarian, Tongkat Ali, fenugreek, and nettle root. Because the formula includes L-Citrulline, the most defensible way to frame it is as a nutritional support protocol for men who want to support blood flow, endothelial function, and nitric oxide biology, not as a replacement for medical treatment. So the practical message is this: protect the microbiome that helps make nitric oxide, feed the pathway with the right inputs, and respect the fact that erectile dysfunction can be a cardiovascular warning sign. If you're taking blood pressure medicine, nitrates, or have heart disease, do not self-direct this blindly. Speak with your cardiologist or physician before changing anything. Cialis, sildenafil, and related PDE5 inhibitors have important interaction and safety considerations, and medical review is essential when cardiovascular disease or nitrates are involved. Check the link in the description for the blood flow and endothelial blueprint. This video is for educational purposes only. Erectile dysfunction may signal underlying cardiovascular disease, hypertension, or diabetes. Consult your physician or cardiologist before starting any supplement, stopping any medication, or making changes to your medical routine.